I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. It's an app. Touch the app on your phone. Opens right up to hundreds and hundreds of courses, each of which has a dozen to 24 lectures. A annual subscription, just like with Netflix or Hulu or any of these, gets you access to all the content. You can skip around courses. You can skip around lectures, listen to as much as you want or not. I just opened one up here on great heroes and discoveries of astronomy. And you just touch on any of the lectures. Here's one, Carl Sagan, the Great Space Communicator, which I just listened to, which was really nice. And you can listen to it at 1.25 speed, which I do there, which makes it about a 19-20 minute lecture rather than 30 minutes. So you can do that on a good workout or drive or commute or whatever. So here's the deal. When you subscribe through my podcast at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer, you get a free trial and 20% off the annual fee, which comes out to about $30 off, which is a super deal. And again, you get access to all this great online content you can listen to or watch pretty much anytime. And so again, it's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer to get your free trial and your discount. Okay. My guest today is Naomi Oreskes, the author of this book, Why Trust Science? The entire book is the answer to that question. Naomi is an American historian of science. She became professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University in 2013 after 15 years as professor of history and science studies at the University of California, San Diego. Oreskes is the author or co-author of 7 books and over 150 articles, essays, and opinion pieces, including Merchants of Doubt, which a documentary was made by Robbie Kenner, in which I also appear, about the climate deniers. Anyway, it's a great film, well worth watching because the book is really important. She also wrote The Collapse of Western Civilization, Discerning Experts, and then of course the latest one, Why Trust Science. And so with that, I give you Naomi Oreskes. We talk about, well, what is science? Why trust it? What is the scientific method? To what extent science involves consensus, method, evidence, values, and humility, her 5 points that she hits home in the book. We talk about climate skeptics and other kinds of skeptics and why we should believe certain groups and not others, how expertise works in science. We talk about dental flossing and the importance of perspectival and viewpoint diversity in any community of people trying to figure out what's true. And then we talk about Bayesian reasoning and determined causality in social and medical sciences and how hard that is. And we talk about model-dependent realism and to what extent our models and maps of the world determine what we see versus to what extent it's really there. Anyway, it's a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. I give you Naomi Oreskes. I'm a longtime fan of your work and writings. I don't think we've ever met in person. We had that connection. No, did we?
We did. We met once at the Athenaeum when I was visiting Caltech. But that's okay. It was a while ago.
Right. Yes, right. Yeah, when we had our lecture series there. Well, you know,
I remembering all the people I've met too.
Well, we had that connection through Robbie Kenner's film, Merchants of Doubt, based on your book, which is just such a great film. They actually sent a camera crew to Freedom Fest when I was debating this guy from the Heartland Institute. And, they showed a few clips of that, but it was a wild afternoon. I mean, libertarians tend to be pretty pro-science and technology. In fact, they're almost fanatical about it in terms of like solving social problems. Science and technology is going to do it. Unless you hit one of their hot button value issues, which is a point you make in your book, then all of a sudden the data goes out the window, and they were largely on his side. That was really quite amusing. But well, I thought your book, of course, I've already introduced it. Why Trust Science? I love a book with my rule is the title or subtitle should tell the reader what the book is about, and you did it in just 3 words. It's so perfect. Because we're
people say, what's the argument of the book? I said the argument of the book is the answer to that question.
That's right. Yes, and never has that been more important than now, because when we started, it was mainly just sort of creationism and then a little Holocaust denial and a few other issues. But since then, climate change and vaccines and all these things have really risen to the top of the social perception of science. And So let's start with the replication crisis. I'll just give you a little anecdote on this to introduce the problem you can then address. That is to say, we've always been skeptical of psi or psychic power, ESP, that sort of thing. And the believers are always saying, okay, come on, what's it going to take to convince you? And I said, well, a professional study by a real scientist published in a peer-reviewed journal. So then along comes Daryl Bem, who's a world-renowned experimental psychologist who publishes this study in the Journal of Social and Personality Social Psychology, one of the most respected journals in all of social science, in a rigorously controlled experiment and so on and so forth. So, of course, they come to me and go, all right, Shermer, we did it. Now what? Are you going to change your mind and believe in science? Like, well, okay, I'm going to have to dig into this thing deep. And it took, a few months before really professional experimental psychologists who specialize in research methodologies and statistics, which I don't, to kind of pull out what the problems were. Oh, well, he ran 9 experiments, but only reported 3 of them. And of the 3, only 1 was technically, statistically significant. And he didn't run them in that order. And, there was half a dozen other things. It's like, oh, okay, I see. But to be fair to the other side, they kind of passed the criteria we initially set up for them. And so maybe that's an introduction to, just a simple thing like here's our method. If you pass it, you're in the club and you get to count what you believe in as reliable knowledge.
Right. So it's not that simple, unfortunately. And I would say you made a tactical error. What you should have said was not a study or a paper, but a body of papers, a body of knowledge. And this is one of the main points I make in the book, that scientific knowledge isn't based on one study, no matter how good it may seem to be. And it's not based on one person, no matter how smart that person can be. We don't believe in quantum mechanics just because of Niels Bohr, right? Or, quantum chromodynamics, is it because of Richard Feynman? And we don't believe in plate tectonics just because of one geologist like Alfred Wegener. Scientists accept claims after intense scrutiny of bodies of evidence. And often that means that it takes a long time for scientists to come to agreement on important issues, often decades, sometimes even centuries. And when they do, it's because there's a robust body of work, typically done by many different people, and typically looking at a problem from many different angles. So, yes, sometimes we do have single studies that say things that, we kind of think don't seem really credible. And that's why we ask for replication. That's why we ask for bodies of evidence.
Yeah, so the replication crisis we're going through is not just on that example, but hundreds, really thousands maybe, of studies in not just social science, but also the medical sciences. Here, the systems are so complex that the chances that any one experimenter got it right and controlled for all the intervening variables and measured the one and only one they were interested in is pretty low. So you end up with a lot of these kind of cutesy studies where, let's say, if your desktop on your laptop is clean, you make more you give a bigger donation to charity, or what was the other one? If you're standing at the top of the escalator versus the bottom of the escalator, you donate more money. And there's just hundreds like that. Or if you hold a warm glass of water versus a cold glass of water when you meet somebody, you perceive them to be warm or cold, and none of those turned out to be replicable.
Right. So exactly. So again, it reinforces the point. The natural world is really complicated, and that's why science is challenging. That's why science is exciting. And that's why when we actually figure something out, we can feel really good about it, because you have to look at things from lots of different angles. And so that's why individual studies are almost never by themselves significant enough. The other thing is that the media often paid a lot of attention to surprising studies, because after all, it's not a story if it's not surprising. But that means that the media are actually biasing what they report. They're cherry picking things that are surprising, counterintuitive, weird. And so that means that there's actually a high likelihood that the reason why they're surprising is actually wrong. And so it's one of the problems with media coverage of science, that it's not interesting and exciting for the media. If someone publishes a paper that says, oh yeah, yet another paper proving that climate change is real, yet another paper adding a second decimal place on the climate sensitivity, that's not going to be reported in the media because it's not interesting. But if someone comes along and says, well, wait a second, I think I've refuted, all the scientific evidence. Let's take the recent one. I've refuted all the scientific evidence that eating red meat is bad for your health. That gets a lot of attention. Turns out that particular study also was deeply flawed. So, we have this tension, right? We want to be excited. We want to pay attention to the new exciting things. And we do want to pay attention to breakthroughs, right? We don't want to be the guy standing around saying, I don't believe Einstein, right? So there's this weird tension, real pressure. We want to pay attention to things that are surprising because there's a possibility that they might be right. And we need to be open-minded to that possibility. But we also have to have a kind of healthy skepticism and say, okay, well, where's the body of evidence? And what do other experts have to say about this? And does this hold up when we look at it from a bunch of different angles?
Yeah, I had Stuart Ritchie on the podcast, and he was talking about trying to replicate BEM, and they couldn't replicate it. And that same journal said, well, we're not interested in publishing a non-replicable study. What's interesting about that? It's like, well, but it's important. And that's
right. Journal editors have been grappling with this, and it is a difficult question because, it's not as difficult in my opinion as it used to be. It used to be that space in journals was really at a premium, especially the best journals, and it was expensive to publish high quality journals. Even the paper was expensive, right? Remember the old days, and Science had really glossy papers that they could have high quality reproductions of the graphs and the charts. There's not really as much excuse for that anymore in the world of online publication, but attention is limited. And so the prestigious journals, Science, Nature, Lancet, JAMA, they want to be selective about what they publish, and they only want to publish things that are significant. Fair enough. But what that means is that when people do the hard work of replication, often those journals aren't interested, because if they succeed in replicating it, people say, well, it's not news because Joe already showed that. And if they fail, well, then it's a negative result. And lots of studies now show that there's huge bias against negative results. So there has been a conversation, as you probably know, in the scientific community about doing a better job of publishing negative results, because negative results are very, very important. But it is tough. And the more the scientific community is subject to the pressures of journalistic standards, let's say, that scientists feel this pressure to be doing things that are exciting and big, the worse this problem gets, in my view.
And then maybe there's a problem with the financial landscape of how grants are given, how researchers get that money, which the universities that they're working at, of course, want them to do. And then, the pressure under the journals to publish those particular papers that are super well funded and so on. So maybe there's a problem with the, sort of financing of research. And if it's not there, as you point out, well, then if you turn to tobacco companies or the oil industry to back your research, there's an obvious problem there. So what if the money's just not there, and so you're kind of under pressure to publish to get tenure and so forth and advance your career. So you end up doing the kind of thing BEM did, which is you run 9 experiments and find the one that came out and you publish that, ignore the other 8 or whatever.
Right. And that's definitely a problem. I mean, the whole universe of funding we could spend an entire hour just talking about that. Of course, there are so many elements of that are significant and important. But certainly one of the important elements is that all scientists, no matter who they're getting their funding from, have pressure to produce results, right? And we see this with government agencies. We see with private foundation, what was the product? What did you produce? And so let's say you're a really careful researcher, and for whatever reason, the experiments don't work or the study doesn't yield a clear result. Well, the honest thing to say would be, we really didn't get anything out of that work, and we just need to move on and do something else. But that's almost impossible to do in the current funding climate. And I think that's part of the pressure that leads to things like p-hacking. So you've collected all this data, and it's not statistically significant with respect to hypothesis that you thought you were testing. So what do you do now? Well, let me just see if I just look at the data a different way, if I slice it and dice it. And you can easily see why people under pressure, especially young scientists who are under pressure to, produce a body of work before they come up for tenure, or a body of work to be competitive on the job market. I mean, if I'd spent a year working on something that didn't pan out, I'd be like, okay, whatever, I've got tenure, right? At my age and stage in the career, if I lost a year to something that didn't pan out, it wouldn't be a big deal. But for young scientists, it could be career destroying. And so there's this tremendous pressure to find something to report. And I think that is part of why, we've seen the p-hacking crisis in psychology. right? You have all this data and you feel the pressure to say something about it. And so you find something to say, even though in many cases what you're saying is probably not statistically valid.
No, so this is different than outright fraud where you just make up stuff, which has happened. And that,
Right.
that usually gets ferreted out by other scientists or grad students in the department or whatever. So that part works reasonably well to catch, well, as far as we know, catch the ones. But so explain p-hacking a little bit more. What is it? Is it an unconscious bias? Are they consciously doing something that they shouldn't be doing?
Well, I'm not an expert in the p-hacking crisis. There are other people who have looked at it more closely than I have. But I think the evidence that we've seen, so p-hacking is basically you have a set of data. It doesn't achieve the statistical significance with respect to the hypothesis that you said you were testing, but some portion of the data or the data interpreted in light of a different question might in fact achieve statistical significance. And so you can sort of say divide up the data set. Like, for example, you were looking at men and women and you find that it wasn't statistically significant with respect to the whole population, but it actually might be with respect to women. Now, this is an interesting thing because it's not necessarily wrong, right? It could be that you actually did hit on something significant, but it could also be that by manipulating the data this way, that you like sort of artificially yield a meaningful result when it isn't actually really there. And I think, Dorothy Bishop is really great on this issue. She has some wonderful podcasts that she's done. One of the things she says is that she doesn't think most of this is deliberately fraudulent. She thinks it's a combination of, sort of the pressure that I was just referring to, the pressure to come up with some results, and also really poor training in statistics. I mean, many, many scientists use statistics as a kind of black box. They don't actually have training in statistics. They don't understand what the theoretical foundations of these test mechanisms are. And so they don't necessarily understand why what they've done is wrong. And so part of the challenge then is to make sure that people are better trained in statistics. And this issue has sort of blew up in psychology because that's where it was shown to be a big problem. But I've certainly experienced in my own work, and I actually do have formal training in statistics, a little known fact about me. And I've been, all through my career, been stunned at the incredibly sloppy way in which many of my colleagues use statistics. So, and it's a tricky one because there are many tools we use. Like I use my computer. I don't really know how Zoom works, but I use it anyway. There are many tools we use, even though we don't really understand them. And sometimes that's okay. Like we don't expect ordinary scientists to be experts in computer hardware or really understand, the engineering behind Zoom. But when it comes to statistics, if you don't understand the theoretical basis for how something like a p-test develops in the first place, then it's very easy to misuse it. And that's what we've seen happen.
Yeah, you can certainly understand how it would happen. Again, leaving out outright fraud, just the human psychology of the confirmation bias and the hindsight bias and so forth is enough to explain most of the replication crisis. So let's go back in time and just sort of talk about the development of the scientific method, whatever that is. Say go back to Galileo or Copernicus or something, Bacon maybe. And all of it seems to be designed around this idea that we are flawed and we're going to find what we expect to find. So we need to have some kind of controls here. And then sort of walk us through this. Are we just trying to verify our hypothesis? Are we trying to falsify our hypothesis or some combination thereof? And that'll get us into the modern philosophy of science.
Sure. Well, I think what you said just now is exactly right. If you look at some of the early work that was done in philosophy of science and continuing into the modern era, so much of it is focused on the recognition that people are flawed, that we tend to want to believe the things we want to believe, and we look for evidence to support those things. In fact, the whole notion of motivated reasoning, which has become, very au courant of late, Francis Bacon talks about it. Jane Austen talks about it in Emma. So this idea that people look for evidence to confirm what they already know or already believe, this is a very old idea. We've just in recent years put new language on it. So the idea of an experimental method or a scientific method or a critical method or falsification is all about finding ways to address that. And so if we go back to Francis Bacon, his crucial argument is about observation and experience. It's about having an empirical method, which is to say, it's not just about what we think, what we believe, what we imagine, but it's about going out into the world and finding evidence that will confirm or deny that. And so Bacon famously developed this notion of a crucial experiment. What experiment could you do that would give you information that would tell you whether this idea was right or wrong? Now, since Bacon, 400 years later, we realize that the notion of a crucial experiment is a little too simple. Turns out you could do an experiment that you think is a crucial experiment, but if it fails, then you can come up with all kinds of reasons, some bad, but some good, about why that experiment might have failed. And it doesn't necessarily prove that the idea was wrong. And this, of course, is the big critique of Karl Popper. So the idea of falsification is really, really attractive because it's a simple explanation for what makes science science, right? We test a hypothesis and we try to refute it. And if we can't refute it, then, okay, things are pretty good. And so Popper very famously said that the method of science is falsification. And lots of scientists I've met think that. But it's not really true because, as I just said, we could do a great experiment. The experiment might fail, but it might be because there was something wrong with the equipment. Or the experiment might fail because it might be that we've misestimated the size of the effect that we're looking for. And of course, this is the famous case that I've talked about in many of my public lectures, the problem of stellar parallax. So when Copernicus says the planets are moving, astronomers say, okay, well, if that's true, there ought to be stellar parallax. The angular perspective, the angles to the stars should change when we look at them in December compared to when we look at them in June. And when people looked for that effect, they didn't find it. Now, today we wouldn't say it was because Copernicus was wrong. We would say the Earth is moving, and we know that pretty well. But the mistake they made is that they expected a very large effect, whereas now we would say the universe is so big and the stars are so far away that, yes, stellar parallax exists. And in fact, it was finally detected in the 19th century. But it's such a small effect that it took really, really, really good instruments to be able to find it. So just because the experiment fails doesn't mean the theory is false. And so this is why science gets really complicated. There isn't one simple thing, one crucial experiment that we can do, but we can collect bodies of evidence. And in the case of Copernicus, scientists came up with a bunch of other good reasons to think that that theory was probably right, even though it failed the test of stellar parallax.
Yeah, it's almost like the no true Scotsman argument. No matter what example you give to counter, it's like, well, that's not a true Scotsman. That's not a true theory. That's not true communism. Well, Popper was in part trying to refute communism as a scientific idea. And no matter which failed example you give, somebody would just say, well, that's not true communism. Right? And to be fair, free market capitalists do the same thing. Well, they're not really free market capitalists. So...
Right. And that's a great example because the point is it's a good lesson against overgeneralization and also about erroneous extensions of arguments from one domain to another. So there were lots of good arguments that Karl Popper could have made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s about why communism was not a great system. But instead of making that, he became kind of, I would say, it'd be fair to say, almost fixated in proving that it wasn't scientific. Well, so what? I mean, if it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea, right? And it's obviously it was a political system and it was a claim about economies. And there was lots of good empirical evidence to show that the Russian economy wasn't working well. So, I mean, personally, as an empiricist, I would say rather than make a big argument about whether Marxism was or wasn't science, a better argument simply would have been to have been empirical about it and say, look, the Soviet system is failing. It's not giving its people food. Not producing goods and services, and it's oppressing people politically as well. So isn't that enough? I mean, why do you also have to worry about whether Marxism is scientific or not? So in my opinion, Popper kind of went a little off the rails on that, which is a shame because in other ways, he's an incredibly important thinker.
Yes, and one of his other inspirations was the Eddington experiments with Einstein's theory of relativity that the sun would deflect starlight from the stars behind the sun during an eclipse so that you can see what they are, compared to 6 months earlier when you took a picture when there's no sun in the middle of the night. You can see where the stars are supposed to be located. And, I've told this story incorrectly, shortly, briefly, like this was the, kind of attempt to falsify Einstein. It failed to falsify. In fact, it confirmed exactly what he predicted and so on and so forth. even knowing what the real story is, because like in my Scientific American column, which you know, right, you only get 700 words, so you can't spend 600 words explaining, well, it's not quite that simple, really. He found this and this other team found that, and they had this big argument, and it went on, and Eddington won the argument, even though his data wasn't that much better than the other data, and both of them were kind of complicated by distortion of the mirror and the cloud cover and this and that, and so on. This goes on and on. You talk about this, and other historians of science as well. It's just not a neat story. The neat story is Eddington went out there, found and tested it and confirmed Einstein. And in the public eye, that is what happened. Einstein became world famous right after that. Remember the New York Times? We've all seen the New York Times headline, lights all askew and the cosmos is all upside down. Oh my God. And that's not what happened.
Right. And of course, this is one of the big challenges of being a historian. And so as a historian of science, it's even worse because the realities are complicated. But despite that, there are still things we can say, intelligent things we can say about the role of evidence, the role of experimentation. And so the Eclipse expedition is important. It was an important prediction of the theory. And overall, that prediction was shown to be correct, right? So in the fullness of time, we can say that that is a nice example of a theory making a surprising prediction that turns out to be true. But if the experiment had failed and not detected it, then there would have just been a lot more work to do. And then scientists would have had to try and try again. And at a certain point, they might have come to the conclusion, well, this isn't working. But then the question becomes, well, what is that point? And that's where there's no rule. And that's why I always say there is no scientific method singular, because these are judgment calls. They're judgments of experts. And so that's why ultimately we have to understand science as a human activity. It's not really rule bound, even though we might attempt to come up with the rules that we think are operating. It's really about people making judgments about the quality of evidence, the quantity of evidence, the persuasiveness of evidence. And so these are all human things. And then the question is, well, who's making that judgment? And then the answer is experts. And so that's why in my book, I talk a lot about expertise, because it's very fashionable now to say, oh, I don't trust experts. And I've met really, really smart people. I call this the business class problem. You get an upgrade and you're all excited to be able to sit in a comfortable seat, but then you have to sit next to some business guy who reads the Wall Street Journal and starts telling you why he doesn't trust experts. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, I get it. Experts are human beings. They make mistakes. And certainly experts on Wall Street, don't always have a great track record. And if anybody could really predict the stock market, then of course they would be very, very rich. But in science, we do have expertise, and it's crucial. We can't do science without expertise, because if we ask the question, well, who's going to judge that Eddington expedition? Who's going to judge whether the claims are correct, whether the measurements were accurate enough? The only people who can do that are other experts. And so science relies on expertise, and it relies on experts judging other experts. And that's not always comfortable, especially, I think, in a democracy and in a society like America, where we tend to be radically individualistic and think that we should all, decide for ourselves. And, people go on Oprah and they talk about my truth. I have to say, that whole my truth gets me kind of not that happy, because, I understand that people have different experiences and that people see the world through the light of experience. That's fine. But when it comes to the facts of the natural world, there's a point at which it's not my truth or your truth, but it is, as best as we can tell, the truth about the world. And that's what scientific expertise is about trying as best as we can to figure out what those scientific truths are.
I recall a story in the 90s. There was an article in the New York Times about some measurement of stellar ages that were older than the universe was estimated to be old. How can the daughter be older than the mother, whatever. So I remember thinking, ooh, this might make a good story for Skeptic. We should be skeptical of some things. What should we be skeptical about? But what do I know? I'm a social scientist. So I call Kip Thorne at Caltech. It's like, Kip, what's the story with this? Oh, don't worry about it. It's error measurement and variation, this and that. We just don't know this. Just wait. We'll figure it out in a couple of years. And sure enough, they refined the error bars were super wide, then the error bars got narrower and narrower, and finally the universe was older than the stars. Okay. End of story. There was no story there. But you could see, if you weren't skeptical, you could think, oh, there's a story, which this New York Times article apparently thought that would be a good story. And, So there, now it's not an argument from authority. I'm not calling Kip Thorne because I think he's smarter than me or whatever. It's just that this is what he does, and I don't do that. And it's not that I have faith that Kip Thorne is the guy, but I have faith that the system that he works in, because he's not the only one. There's hundreds, thousands, whatever, astrophysicists and whatnot, and they all are kind of competitive, and that somewhere along the line, if he had some crazy idea, his colleagues would have, combated with him about that, and they would have hashed all that out in their journals and conferences. By the time it gets to me, it's all kind of filtered out, and I can take it with some confidence. Faith is the wrong word. I'd say confidence that what we're getting is something like truth with a small t. And so there's your example of the social nature operating underneath the kind of the public radar. We don't know what they're doing, but we trust that there's some system in place. So is it possible for a collective to go off the rails and down some pathway that turns out not to be true? You talked about eugenics, and that, people will often say, well, look, they were wrong about eugenics, so why should we believe climate scientists now? Something like that. So talk about the difference there.
Right. Well, clearly it is possible for people to go off the rails collectively, and I don't think we should ever think that the scientific community is immune from the possibility of being, wrong as a group. And certainly we have plenty of cases in the history of science where scientists have changed their view about important matters. But I think there's a couple of distinctions we might want to make. Well, so one thing is that science is a learning process. I mean, part of the reason science is exciting is because scientists discover new things. And if science is going to be a process of discovery, then that necessarily means that in some cases, those discoveries will cause us to rethink what we used to think. So we could view that as scientists having egg on their face because now they have to change what they view, or we could view it as scientists learning. So I prefer to view it as scientists learning, right? But it is a reminder to everyone, both people who produce science and people who consume it, that because it is a learning process, we have to be open to the possibility that what we think today might turn out tomorrow not to be correct. And so that for me is always like an argument for humility, right? I've said many times that if there is a lesson of the history of science, if there is one lesson, it's humility, that, we should be open to the possibility that things could change, and open to the possibility that even things we believe very strongly are true based on huge amounts of evidence, in the future we might look at it in a different way. So that's sort of one thing. The other thing is about this question of authority. So, and I've struggled with this as well, because, when I was writing Why Trust Science, I felt myself grappling with, well, is this just an appeal to authority? And I think it's exactly what you said. In a way, it kind of is, but it's a particular kind of authority. It's not authority simply because a person holds a position, like they're the president of the United States, or they're the Pope, or they're the chair of my department. It's because they actually have built a reputation based on their work and their talent and their participation, as you said, in a community of people who are working together to learn. And so that, as you say, it's not the authority of Kip Thorne as Kip Thorne, man of a certain age, but it's Kip Thorne as a physicist who participates in the project of modern physics, who's been trained at top universities, who teaches at a top university, and whose own colleagues are very, very eager to call him out if he makes a mistake, right? Because the whole scientific community is standing by to say, wait, you're wrong. And the more famous the person is, and the more well-established the claim is, the more credit there can be. And this is something I often say to climate change skeptics and deniers. If it were really true that there was something really, really, really wrong with climate models, you'd have every young scientist on the planet trying to prove it, because the attention and the fame and the professional rewards that would come would be so huge. So the incentives are actually in favor of overturning established belief, not in favor of simply reinforcing it. And that's a very, very strong reason to have confidence in science, because, if something really is wrong, there are a lot of people ready to find it. Yeah. And then I was going to say something more about eugenics. So, the eugenics thing is always hard to talk about calmly. It's hard not to get a little hot under the collar, because it always, for me, brings up the specter of the late Michael Crichton, who I think you knew, right? So Crichton made this very public argument that scientists were wrong about eugenics, and therefore, why should we believe them about climate change? So that argument is illogical because we're talking about two entirely different groups of people at two entirely different times. So just from a logical standpoint, if one group of scientists, let's say in the 1910s, is wrong about something, that tells us just about nothing about an entirely different group of scientists 100 years later in the 2010s working on a completely different question. So it might be the case that the scientists who were wrong about eugenics, we might feel like those people were discredited. And we might feel like, let's say you were living in, let's say, the 1930s, you might not be very impressed by what some of those people had to say in later years about other biological issues, right? Like it is legitimate to say if a person has been really wrong about something, and I can think of, let's say, some contemporary economists who might fall into this category, then we might be skeptical about, wanting to seek their advice about economic questions when they were, extremely wrong about, I don't know, let's just say financial deregulation. But now we're in a whole different century with different people working on different things. And so the question then becomes, well, what is the evidence of the claims that these people are bringing to bear? And is that evidence robust? Is there a lot of it? And do different scientists looking at the problems in different ways share the same conclusions? And this is one reason why I think climate science actually, to me, is probably one of the most robust sciences ever in the history of science, because we have had so many people looking at this problem. And we have scientists from literally all over the globe and looking at it in so many different ways. So even if one group of them were wrong about something, which they could definitely be, but you have so many others, and even if there was some kind of American groupthink going on, which, is possible, could happen, but you have scientists from Germany and France and Australia, New Zealand and Botswana and South Africa and Korea and Singapore. I mean, it's just not plausible that all of these people are subject to the same, groupthink. And so that, I think, is one of the really important arguments in favor of, well, in the book, I make this case for diversity in science. And by that, I don't just mean racial diversity, but I mean, all the kinds of intellectual and cultural diversity that people bring to the table in the climate change arena.
Yeah, you call that perspectival diversity, which I liked. Often in politics, just called viewpoint diversity. So you should have people from different political parties or political persuasions when you're having a debate about immigration or tax rates or whatever, because there's not exactly an empirical truth to be discovered there. Here I make a distinction, say, between empirical truths and political truths. So, what's the right upper tax bracket percentage? It's 37% right now. What's the right number? Well, I don't know, 78%, 20%, who knows? I mean, there is no right answer. It's what's your goal as a society.
Right, but that's a good example, though, also of, some of the challenges of the social sciences. Right. What the right answer, it's funny you use that example because I was actually looking at that very example myself the other day. So the right answer isn't simply an empirical question because it has a lot to do with our values, our political preferences. But on the other hand, it's not entirely non-empirical either. We can look at times in U.S. history when the tax rates have been different, and we can see, well, how did the economy do? Let's say under Dwight Eisenhower versus, under Ronald Reagan or whatever. And of course, it's not the only variable. These are very, very complex systems, but there is some empirical evidence that can be brought to bear on the question. And this is one reason why I think the social sciences get tricky, but can still be approached scientifically. We can still pose certain kinds of empirical questions. They may not be determinative in quite the same way that an empirical question might be in physics, but they can contribute to informed discussion, right?
But here, see,
I wanted to say one.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to say one other thing about the eugenics case too, since it's such a complicated case, but it's also such an important one. So one of the things I did when I was writing Why Trust Science was to go back and look at that case again, and to say, well, in hindsight, can we identify something that scientists did wrong? And the big discovery I made when I went back and looked at that material was that Crichton was simply wrong in his premise. So he said, well, there was a consensus about eugenics. Well, guess what? Turns out that's not true. Turns out there were actually big arguments among scientists themselves, even setting aside the moral and the political side, big arguments among scientists themselves. And so this is one reason why in the book I argue that the category of consensus is actually extremely important. Because if scientists don't have a consensus, then that is telling us that maybe we need to do more work. Maybe the mainstream view is wrong. Maybe the problem is poorly posed. something isn't right. But if scientists have studied something, and particularly if the community is diverse and they have looked at the issue from a number of different perspectives, and then they have come to a consensus, and if scientists have been clear about what the consensus is, so, when I talk about climate change, I actually don't really like it when people say, oh, there's a consensus about climate change. That's too vague. There's a consensus that climate change is real, that it's underway, and it's caused by human activity. So as long as scientists are being clear what the consensus claim is, then I think that's a very powerful and important thing for us to know. Do scientists agree about this issue or not? And in the case of eugenics, what we saw was actually the answer was not.
Yeah, so that's a really good point you make in the book. Also, analogously, when I was encountering the creationists in the 80s and 90s, then I made an analogy with the climate deniers or skeptics in this way, that it's not like all these different scientists who work in evolutionary theory, geologists, paleontologists, people that study the flowering of plants, or comparative physiology and anatomy, and on and on and on. There's like dozens of different fields that all point to this one conclusion. I call this convergence of evidence. William Ewell called that the consilience of inductions, independently of one another. I mean, these are different scientists working in different fields. They don't publish in the same journals. They don't attend the same conferences. They don't even know each other, much less, meet on the weekends to get their stories straight to combat the evil creationists, because they're all atheists and they don't want there to be a God, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And it's the same thing with the climate scientists, the guys that are studying glaciers, or, sea level rise, or cloud covers, or again, flowering of plants at earlier and earlier in the season. And people studying these animals or those, whatever. Again, there's dozens of them, and they're all pointing to those conclusions. So when we say I think this comes from some of your work as well, the 97% figure you always see quoted, that's not the important part. The important part is the independence of that those 97% are converging to this one. Okay, what about the 3%? Because sometimes people in the minority turn out to be right and the whole majority are wrong. But the 3% don't point to any one particular conclusion. It's the sunspot activity. No, it's not the sunspot activity. It's cloud covers and the models are wrong. No, it's this other, it's the elliptical orbit or whatever it is. So they don't converge to anything. And that should increase our confidence. So here, just let's just think about that kind of confirmation versus falsification. We're sort of reasoning in a Bayesian way. We're saying, the more these independent lines of inquiry point to this conclusion, our priors go up, increasing the credence of our confidence that, AGW is true, let's say, true with a small t. So to dismantle that, you'd have to falsify like hundreds or thousands of experiments by these independent, not like if you found one study that showed this one error. I call that the fossil fallacy, because Gish used to say, just show me one transitional fossil, just one. And the one time I debated him is when Ambulocetus natans, that fossil transition between whales and land mammals. And so I put that the fossil up there. So he had one fossil here and one fossil here in the gap. I go, here, that's in the gap. He goes, now there's two gaps in the fossil record. So the more evidence you have, the worse your argument is. Like, no, that's backwards.
Right. The more gaps. Right.
Or yeah,
right, exactly.
And so I call it the fossil fallacy, and in a way, that's what climate skeptics are doing. They're, they pick that one anomaly hunting or whatever, ignoring the vast body that converges. So again, there's nothing magical about 97%. It's like if it was 96%, we'd have doubt. It's just that whoever's challenging the status quo, they're not coming up with a better explanation that accounts for the data that the majority or the mainstream theory does.
Right. I think that's a really important point because, as well as anyone that there are big arguments in physics about quantum theory and, whether the world is truly indeterministic or not. And there have been dissenters, some of whom are credible physicists. But interestingly, most of those people have had alternative theories, right? Whereas with the climate change deniers, what you find as you scratch the surface, there's actually nothing there in most cases. And the few times they have alternative theories, like, the sunspots, well, we have the data to show that those are wrong. Or volcanoes. This is a question I get all the time. How do we know it's not volcanoes? We know it's not volcanoes. We have many lines of evidence to show us that it's not volcanoes. And then the volcanoes become hidden under the ocean. And then you begin to see it begins to have this sort of conspiratorial quality that, oh, you're hiding the volcanoes. Well, I'm a geologist. It's not actually that easy to hide volcanoes. And the US Navy has mapped the ocean floor very, very closely. And we know where the active volcanoes are, and we know how active they are. So it's really like clutching at straws. They're desperately trying not to believe this. And that is essentially what became the argument of merchants of doubt. Why are these people trying so hard not to believe that this is true? And that's then get carried into the realms of politics and ideology and other motivating factors that make people reject evidence, even when that evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, you talk about conflating facts and values here. When a conservative hears anthropogenic global warming, their brain autocorrects that to, you're against free market capitalism. And it's like, what has that got to do with CO2 gases? And same thing with gun control. When I debate gun control, I debated John Lott, the author of that book, More Guns, Less Crime. And we did a series of debates. And, I noticed, I got the impression from the audience that it really wasn't about gun control. Guns were like a proxy for freedom, autonomy, independence from big government, that kind of thing. It's like, well, I believe in freedom and independence, but the gun thing is this is a specific thing here. But their brains are kind of autocorrect, so it was a proxy for something else. And I think in creationism is
right. We see that in all these things. The climate denial isn't really about the climate. Creationism isn't really about evolutionary theory. Refusing to wear masks isn't actually about masks, right? These things are almost always our proxies for other political, social, or theological arguments. I was just reviewing the latest. Pew did a new poll last year on the creationism thing. And one of the things they did that was nice was that for years they had a sort of two-pronged question, which comes closer to your belief. Humans evolved over time with no supernatural intervention, or humans evolved, or no, humans were created, exactly as they are today. And when you put it in that kind of polarized way, you get a polarized result. And about 30% of Americans said, no, humans have been always exactly the same way they always have. But this most recent study, they made it more three-pronged, was sort of like what we would call the scientific view on one end, humans being exactly static on the other. But in the middle, this sort of middle ground where there has been evolution and things have changed, but God is somehow involved in guiding the process. And one of the things we've learned in recent years is that many people think that. Well, that's a kind of interesting position because science can't prove that that's wrong, right? Scientists would say, we don't need, it's like the famous Laplace comment about, I don't need that hypothesis, right? We can't prove it's wrong, but, I'm okay with that. I mean, if somebody's willing to accept the scientific evidence and say, but I still think that somehow God's behind it all. Well, okay, that's fine, right? We could live with that. So by being willing to have a nuanced conversation about what's really happening and not necessarily assuming that it has to be two sides, yes, no, either or, we can get a better understanding of what it is people think and why they think it and why it's important to them. Because as you also know, since you've debated creationists, many creationists, ultimately, it really has nothing to do with science. It has to do with the meaning of life. And there's a famous line that I think Ken Miller quotes in one of his books. Rick Santorum said, if evolution is true, it means that human beings are mistakes. And I remember when I read that, I thought, well, some human beings might be mistakes, right? But that's actually not what evolutionary theory says, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, they mistake that randomness. We're just random chance. That's not what Dawkins constantly points to. It's not random. It's random genetic mutation, but non-random cumulative selection. That's his T-shirt definition of natural selection. Non-random. It's not. There's a directionality to it. So there you can do what Darwin did in the second edition of The Origin of Species. He made the argument against people that were challenging him on religious grounds. Why are you finding this threatening? Back in Newton's day, there were some theists who argued, oh, this is a threat to religion. And Newton himself said, no, this is how God did it. He used gravity to create solar systems and planets. And this, kind of a deist argument. He started the whole thing off and it runs. And maybe he has to reach in and stir the particles once in a while because the whole thing would run down too quickly based on their mathematical models they had at the time. But anyway, Darwin said, why can't evolution be, this is how God did it? Essentially, he was saying much more elegantly than I just did.
some of the fault there here does lie with scientists, because we do have scientific colleagues who are aggressive in asserting that, no, God can play no role. There cannot be, the deistic interpretations are wrong. And I won't name names, but you know who we're talking about, right? And I think that's very unhelpful. And I think it's intellectually incorrect because, as you just said, and as Newton himself said, science doesn't disprove the existence of God. Science simply helps us understand what we think has happened, what some of the mechanisms are by which they may have happened. And science seeks naturalistic explanations because that's what science is. That's the game, right? The rules of the road for science is that we seek naturalistic explanations. Whether there could also be supernatural phenomena as well is not a question that a scientist can answer. And so we have to just, it's the old render unto Caesar, or, what Stephen Jay Gould used to talk about the non-competing magisterium. I'm not 100% sure I always agree with the non-competing part because there are areas of overlap. And those areas of overlap are sometimes really interesting and sometimes worth exploring. But they are different kinds of questions. And we can acknowledge that and we can respect the role of faith in people's lives and still be committed to the role of science in helping us understand the natural world.
That you mentioned Ken Miller, I know Ken pretty well. I've read his books, and we've been at conferences together, and I've told this story in this podcast many times, so sorry to my regular listeners. But at one of these conferences, with Dawkins was there, and and Ken goes along. He's as solid a scientist as anybody in evolutionary theory, and at some point, he so I'm a Catholic. I accept the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is the Savior. That's what we believe. So Richard is like, okay, Ken, if we had a piece of the true cross, and on the piece of the true cross was a little bit of flesh, and we could extract the DNA. And of course, Miller saw where this was going, and he's like, Richard, I'm not claiming this is an empirical truth. I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. So how would you distinguish something like empirical truths versus pure religious truths? Like there's no empirical basis for Jesus died for our sins, or even really that he was resurrected. It's just kind of a statement of belief. But then, of course, someone like Richard would say, well, then why believe it? Just because your parents did, or the culture, or the group you happen to belong to? That's not a foundation of reliable knowledge. Why not just give it up?
Right. Well, I mean, the fact that Dawkins can't understand why anyone would have religious faith is a failure of imagination on his part, right? I mean, the fact that he cannot understand why religion is important to people speaks poorly of him, in my view. But I think, I think Dawkins is doing what philosophers would call making a category error. So there are different kinds of ways of approaching the world and approaching life and approaching questions. The empirical method, if we want to call it that, what science does, is based on the idea that we can learn a lot about the world by looking at it, by exploring it, by performing experiments, by collecting data. And there's no question that the empirical method has been hugely powerful. There are so many things we know and do in the modern world that are the result of empirical research, that there is, in my view, no question that science is a productive way of approaching the world. And it's not just my view. I mean, the recent Pew and American Academy of Arts and Sciences studies show the vast majority of Americans think that. I mean, the vast majority of Americans trust science, trust scientists, and think that science makes our lives better. So, the idea that there's a general crisis of trust in science is actually not supported by the evidence. But we also know there are many questions that science can't answer. Science doesn't tell us the meaning of life, doesn't really tell us why we're here, or if there even is a reason why we're here. And for many people, religion plays an important role in guiding their moral values, their beliefs about, why they are here. And that's complementary. And we know from the history of science that most scientists historically have been people of faith of one type or another. Often, like Newton, their faith was not 100% conventional for their time period. And we know that Newton was a Unitarian at a time when most British people were Trinitarians. But, and you look at someone like Ken Miller, Francis Collins, Catherine Hayhoe, the late Sir John Houghton. I mean, there have been many great scientists, even in our own day, who were people of faith. So there's no necessary conflict. There's no evidence, to take Dawkins' perspective, that being a person of faith stands in the way of being a good scientist, or vice versa. So, I find it sad in a way that Dawkins feels so compelled to bash religion. I mean, if he doesn't want to be religious, that's fine. I think we can all respect that choice. And if he doesn't feel the need for it, that's fine too. But to say that, to be so incapable of empathy and understanding that you feel compelled to attack people who
I think he's empathetic.
Strikes me as weird.
Yeah, I think he's empathetic in understanding why people like to be religious or whatever. That is the emotional support it gives. He would like to see secular institutions do that because they're based on facts rather than, well, fairy tales or whatever, just stories. And here, just to be too generous to the other side, let's not just call them stories or myths like they're fake stories. Let's look at them like a Jungian or a more modern version, Jordan Peterson. These myths and stories represent something deep in the human condition about human society and suffering, human nature, longing, emotions. And, there's a whole study of evolutionary psychology applied to literature. Why are Jane Austen novels and Shakespeare plays and so on so perpetually popular? Because they touch deep truths about us. And whether Dostoevsky's, brothers Karamazov, were there really brothers named Karamazov in 19th century Russia? Okay, if you're asking that question, you're missing the point. It's not about those guys. It's about, the modernity arriving in Russia and the tensions and human frailties and jealousy and power struggles and love. And that's what it's about. And that's a kind of truth. I think Richard would agree. Yeah, that's right. But at some point, don't you have to have some basis of empirical founding? Like, well, what are those truths about human nature? Why are they there? Well, then we can turn to, kin selection and reciprocal altruism and the desire to have a good reputation that when violated, people gossip about you. So you need to, kind of own up to that. And, revenge and jealousy and violence, they all have kind of a logic to them. So whether the story is true or not, it's grounded in a kind of a truth that we can discover empirically about human nature, human society, something like that.
Yeah, I think broadly I agree with that, but I guess the additional part I would bring to that is that ultimately many of these things are about meaning. They're about the meaning of life or the meaning that we find in our lives. And these are such complicated and multi-layered questions that when we try to reduce them to empirical questions like kin selection, I think often we do a bad job. And I think particularly when you think about the whole history of the way science has dealt with the question of altruism, right? I mean, for decades, evolutionary biologists bent over backwards to explain away the evidence of altruism because it didn't fit with their evolutionary theories. And they could only explain it if it was, kin related, right? But we have enormous amounts of evidence of altruism towards people to whom we are not biologically related. And we now even have enormous amounts of evidence of that in the animal kingdom as well. And I was just reading something the other day. I mean, it is true that elephant mothers will adopt orphan elephants, even if they're not related to them. So altruism is a real thing. Now, you can try to come up with biological answers to say, well, it's really kin selection, but if you learn to be altruistic to the people you're related to, it kind of spills over. And maybe that's right. But why do we feel compelled to explain it away? Why can't we just say, well, actually, people do care about each other, and all the world's great religions reflect that, and all of the world's great literature reflects that. And you're talking about Dostoevsky, who's one of my favorite writers. I mean, my favorite book is Crime and Punishment, because in a way, his essential question is, why should we be good to other people if we don't have to, right? And that's a huge, important question, which the libertarians you hang out with would do well to think about some more, right? And we give them a reading list and make them reread Crime and Punishment, right? So it's not to say that one day we might not have scientific insights that will complement the insights of literature, but it's to say that they are complementary, and that's fine. And I don't think we need to feel stressed about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, but some scientists want to understand the origins of morality, say, or consciousness. Theists will often argue, there's a handful of proofs left for God's existence. The creation of the universe, the origin of life, the nature of consciousness, the origin of morality. Those sort of big four. As Kant said, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. You guys can't explain that. You scientists can't explain that. Okay, well, we do. We have some explanations for these things. Maybe there's not consensus yet on the origins of life. Apparently, I haven't looked at this literature in a while, but I haven't read anything like, oh, we all know now exactly this is what happened. Okay, but we're working on it. Same thing with the origins of morality. Why would I feel guilty or shame or pride or joy about anything? What is the purpose of those moral emotions? So you can build a kind of selfish gene to reciprocal altruism and kin selection, and then build out from there to a larger social sphere, like even a nation state. Why we would have that kind of brotherly love for people that are like us or speak the same language or whatever, have the same flag, and. But even if you say, well, I don't think you've made your case there, then I would say, okay, what is your explanation? And the theists usually come up with something close to, in many words, God did it, and that that's God gave us this moral sense of right and wrong. Well, that's not really an explanation; those are just words, right? It's like the analogy I use is like when astrophysicists talk about dark energy and dark matter to explain why galaxies are rotating at the speed they are, why the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate, and so on, they don't mean those as explanations. Those are just linguistic placeholders for now we're going to try to figure out what is dark energy, what is dark matter. Is it neutrinos, or is it these brown dwarfs? Is it whatever the latest thing is? And so to me, when a theist says, God did it in so many words, he gave us this sense of right and wrong. Well, how did he do that? And so here I would invoke the, he used evolution to give us a moral sense. And even if you want to throw in, a more popular version of this, group selection. Now, people like Richard and Steven Pinker reject group selection, but let's say it turns out to be true. Ed Wilson and David Sloan Wilson both have built these complex mathematical models to show how group selection could be the target of selection. Okay, I'm still fine with that because at least it's a bottom-up natural explanation for how this arrived. Whether there's a God behind it or not is kind of a secondary question.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting argument, and I basically agree with it, but I guess what I would add to it would be this. So there's nothing wrong with scientists exploring the question of the basis of morality and whether there could be genetic and biological aspects to it. I think that's a legitimate area of research, but the risk, though, is a kind of reductionist approach that then misses other important things. And I think we see this very clearly if you say, look at some of the explanations that have been put forward in recent years for the extreme political polarization that we now experience in America. I mean, first of all, many people have been extremely quick to say how polarized we are. But if you really look at the data, again, it's like a lot of things, it becomes more complicated. So certainly if you look at congressional voting patterns, we are deeply, deeply polarized. But if you look at studies that ask Americans what they think about a lot of things, then it becomes more subtle and more complicated. And there's a lot more overlap than we might at first suspect. But I think more important is that there have been some people in recent years who have been trying to put forward biological arguments. For example, I think there was a book called The Republican Brain or something like that, right? Okay. Well, I think we do know that different people have different ways of approaching problems, and some of this can partly be explained by cognitive science. But when you focus on those kinds of explanations, you miss really important things. Like, for example, 40 years ago, people didn't think that Republicans and Democrats had different brains. So why do we think that now? Because that's not enough time for brains to have evolved differently. And so the sort of kind of I think there's a kind of fetishistic approach that some people, not all, but some people take to biological explanations that actually makes them miss really important evidence. Like, this is different, right? Or if we think about environmental issues, I mean, there's a slide I show all the time. If we go back to the year 1990, Republican Democratic congressional voting on environmental issues was very, very similar. The gap between how Democrats and Republicans voted on environmental questions was like about 10 points. Now it's like 70 points. I mean, Republican and Democrat on environmental issues are just, I'm going to like deliberately put my hands at the corner of the screen, like absolute polar opposites. So our brains didn't change, in the last 30 years, right? Something in our culture did. And so I guess this is the historian of me talking. Culture is really important, and culture cannot be reduced to genes and biology. And when we try to find biological explanations for cultural phenomenon, I think in general that project usually goes very badly. Now, it's not to say that sometime in the future we might not advance to a place where we would have a better explanation of how culture and biology, it's the whole nature-nurture thing, right? I mean, one of the things we've learned in the last, say, 50 or 60 years is that the nature-nurture dichotomy is a false dichotomy, because we know that we all are born with some kind of genetic inheritance, that predisposes us to maybe have some talents and not others. But we also know that, it's what Saint-Exupéry calls Mozart assassiné. You could be born with the greatest musical talent, but if you're not given music lessons, if you're not exposed to instruments, you won't become a great musician. And it's not a coincidence that Mozart's father was also a great musician, right? So we know that it's both ends. You could put me in Mozart's home, give me to Leopold Mozart, and I wouldn't become Wolfgang Amadeus, right? But conversely, if you had put Wolfgang Amadeus in a slum in Sao Paulo, he would not have become Mozart either. And so we know that, right? And so the point is, how can we integrate these insights to say, yes, it's both and there clearly are biological components, but there are strong cultural components as well. And that's really the task of explanation, I think, is to try to be as open-minded as possible to the different elements that play a role in the things we're looking at. But of course, that's hard in science because science is tough. And as we've talked about before, science is competitive and we have to specialize. So it's okay to be a specialist, but I think it's important also to be mindful about the limits of your own specialization and to realize that for some questions, other people may be better equipped to provide meaningful answers.
So much depends on current culture that we're swimming in. This whole Republican brain thing started with that John Jost article, I think it was 2003, and it was differences between liberals and conservatives, self-identified, so this is self-report data, on the big five personality dimensions. So liberals are more open to experience, they travel more, they're more open to engaging with people from different cultures and so on. And Republicans are lower on that. Republicans are higher in conscientiousness, also higher in some elements of neuroticism. So, for example, they startle more easily to a loud noise, or they're more germophobic, like Trump. And that being germophobic is a proxy for wanting to have tighter border controls. And, all this is kind of spun in a way to explain the way Republicans vote, say, from 1995 till, whenever the paper is published. And your point is that, but if we actually look at the last 2 centuries of however conservatives and liberals are defined that way, you're not going to see that kind of polarization. So you're really explaining a current cultural phenomenon rather than some deeply evolved biological mechanism.
Exactly. And especially think about that germaphobe one, which is really great, right? I mean, if you take that seriously, then you might have predicted that it would be Republicans who would be very vigilant about mask wearing. But that's not what happened, right? So again, it tells us that these sorts of traits may be interesting in certain ways, but there are other things going on that are more determinative. Right.
Let's talk a little bit about models and paradigms, because you also talk about Kuhn. Just to introduce this, one of my favorite quotes from Eddington, of all people, since we just talked about him, which I made here in, let's see, where did that page go? Here it is. This is from Arthur Stanley Eddington's The Philosophy of Physical Science. I think it was 1928. So he says, let's suppose that an ichthyologist is exploring the life of the ocean. He casts a net into the water and brings up a fishy assortment. Surveying his catch, he proceeds in the usual manner of a scientist to systematize what it reveals. He arrives at 2 generalizations. 1, no sea creature is less than 2 inches long, and 2, all sea creatures have gills. In applying the analogy, the catch stands for the body of knowledge, which constitutes physical science, and the net for the sensory and intellectual equipment which we use in obtaining it. The casting of the net corresponds to observations. Now, an onlooker may object that the first generalization is wrong. There are plenty of sea creatures under 2 inches long, only your net is not adapted to catch them. The ichthyologist dismisses this objection contemptuously. Anything uncatchable by my net is ipso facto outside the scope of ichthyological knowledge. It is not part of the kingdom of fishes, which has been defined as the theme of ichthyological knowledge. In short, what my net can't catch isn't fish. So I just kind of a stand-in for this problem of, the model that you're using, the instruments you're using to measure something. All this is determinative of what you're going to find.
Right, absolutely. That's a great story. I'm glad you read that. Exactly. And this is one of the reasons why in the book I make a point of criticizing what I call methodological fetishism, that the person who becomes obsessed with his net and defining the science by what that net can catch has become fetishistic about the net. And so the net, of course, is a metaphor here for all of the kinds of methods that we use. And I think, you've you've been observing science for a long time, probably about the same amount of time I have, and we see that many scientists do become fetishistic about their methods. They think, this is the only good method, or this is the best method, and they become convinced that other methods are not meaningful. And so in the book, I give a couple of examples of this, and one of the most important examples has to do with the use of the so-called RCT, the randomized clinical trial in biomedicine. So I think we all recognize that randomized clinical trials are really powerful tools. They've been extremely important in having robust, empirically defensible studies of, say, new drugs. They played an extremely important role in testing of the vaccines against the coronavirus. So no intelligent person would ever say that RCTs are bad. No, they're very, very good, but they also have limits. And there are certain things for which they just don't work. So if an RCT won't work to answer a certain kind of question, is it like the fish? And you say, oh, well, those things aren't part of my science? Or do you say, well, okay, so for other kinds of problems, we need to have other kinds of tools? And so obviously I argue for the latter position.
Would you say that applies to IQ tests that have been kind of reified into something called intelligence that then becomes measurable through this finely tuned scale? And then we infer that in there are these like modules for abstract reasoning or whatever.
Yeah, well, of course, there's a giant literature about IQ tests, and people have been arguing about them ever since they were invented. But I think it's pretty clear that IQ tests do measure something, but exactly what they measure is hard to say. And so it's not to say that they're necessarily always invalid, although certainly some people do think that they're so culturally biased that they are always invalid. My view would be that, they do measure something, but exactly what they measure is still not entirely unclear. Not entirely clear. And it's not really clear how useful they are, right? Because what is the purpose of the IQ test? I mean, we know they were invented originally because, Lewis Terman did think that people were born with innate qualities and that he believed that people should be sorted at an early age, that highly intelligent children should be put on a track towards university education and unintelligent children should be put on a vocational track towards, manual labor and work like that. Well, I think we all know now that that's a highly problematic view. It gets back to what I was saying about Mozart before. I mean, children could be born with a lot of potential, but if you track them into vocational training, well, then there's just no chance that they'll ever become an astronomer, or a geologist. So the idea of using IQ tests to channel people into certain kinds of education, which would then lead to certain kinds of jobs, is one that I think most people today would reject. So then the question is, well, what use or purpose would they have in the contemporary world? And I guess my answer is it's not really clear they actually do have a good use. So I would be not that sympathetic, but, I'd be open to an argument that there is some plausible, useful use of them. But I guess the question is, what would that use really be?
Well, I guess similar to the SAT tests, which are now being kind of eased out of college selection processes, that they predict student outcomes, grades, let's say GPA, and then vocational choices and life income earnings, things like that. That's the claim made. Now, I can see why people are pushing back against it because it seems like it unfairly targets poorer people, and that's often people of color. In my own case, I took the SAT in 1971 in high school. Early 72, I think it was. I never heard of it. My school counselor said, hey, the SAT's this Saturday. I'm like, what's that? Well, it's an aptitude test. I'm like, okay, whatever. That was my total prep, And over the years, I had to take it several times, graduate school and then the GRE and all, that whole thing. And, I was able to bump it up several hundred points, and you're not supposed to be able to do that because it's supposed to just be measuring aptitude. No, this is just an anecdote. But I can see the limitations of it.
There's a lot of evidence to support that people can do better by, practicing. That would be an argument against it being innate, right? But I think also the important thing, too, is that some of these things are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Because if we use a certain kind of test that tends to reflect, students who come from educated backgrounds, students whose parents are educated, particularly if mothers are educated, right? We have good evidence on this. Those students tend to do better on standardized tests, and they also tend to do better in college. But how much of that is because they're already part of a kind of virtuous cycle? of cultural support. I think if standardized tests could be used to identify children with innate talent who are not in positions of privilege and find ways to use it to help those children, then that could be a productive use. And I actually know a few people who do think that standardized tests applied in elementary school, in fact, did help them to be identified as children of talent. So it's not.
There are some studies that they help. Yeah, that they help poor people and people of color who are otherwise lost in the public education system. The SAT plucks them out like, you are special. You're going to, an Ivy League, something like that, and boom, there they are. So it could be used opportunistically that way.
There's a bunch of other bigger questions like, why don't we also test for musical ability or poetry or, so many other things. And if it comes to graduate school, I think nearly all of my colleagues would say that standardized tests don't do a good job of predicting who's going to be a talented historian or, who's going to be a skillful, creative historian, right? That when you get to really high levels of accomplishment, there's a whole lot of other complicated factors that play in. So I guess I would just come back to thinking that I don't think the evidence for this as a useful tool is very strong. And then again, and even the model of plucking the talented child out of obscurity, maybe that's the wrong model. Maybe what we ought to be doing is trying to figure out how to fix our system so that all talented children or all children get the opportunity to develop their talents as best as possible. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and all this assumes, and this is mostly conducted by eggheads who think that the intellectual life is really the only way to have a fulfilling life. In my other life, I'm a lifelong bike racer, cyclist, and the vast majority of my cycling buddies, they have nothing to do with academia, and they're happy, fulfilled people that make a lot of money and they lead successful, meaningful lives. And it's like, well, apparently there is a way to do this without getting a PhD and scoring high on the SAT and GRE. So even
that's right, and that's really important. Right. It's a really important point that many of the people having these arguments have their own biases about what counts as, important talent or what counts as a successful life. And, one of my favorite lines in my own book is when, in the conversation about eugenics, and I've now forgotten if it was Haldane who said it. I think it was who said, somebody could be a very fine pig farmer. Right? Why should we assume that just because a person has a talent for taking care of pigs, that's not a value to society and that it's not a meaningful life for that person, right? There are so many cultural and class prejudices that are built into so many of these conversations, right?
Steve Picker always makes this point about the diversity of ways to be successful and happy in life. So he's a cyclist. So we were on a bike ride one day with one of my buddies when he was visiting Southern California. And he says to my friend, well, what do you do? And he goes, I make ketchup. He's like, really? I've never met somebody that makes ketchup. Okay. And then this ensued a long conversation. And it was like, yeah, that's a good thing. That's a thing. Somebody's got to do it. And it's a fulfilling, anyway. All right. So just a few other things I loved about your book, the flossing story, that here's a story of, a journalist ups the scientist and discovers that flossing is not necessary. I remember this story because the week that broke, I went in for my cleaning, my semi-annual cleaning. And I said, and the technician is upbraiding me for not flossing. And I said, well, there's that study. Now, maybe, I don't really need to floss. So she proceeds to floss my teeth. And then she pulls the string out and goes, you see that? That's your dinner last week. You want that in your mouth for the next month? Because that's what's going to happen. You really think that's not going to have some effect on your gums? I'm like, I'm going to floss twice a day now. Maybe that's that you're kind of, what do you call it, boots on the ground evidence, just like, come on, look.
Right. Or we could say evidence of clinical practice, and this is what I do say in the book, right? So this is a really good example of why, first of all, we shouldn't just believe a single study, and second of all, why journalists sometimes do a big disservice by taking information out of context. So in fairness to that particular journalist, he had been alerted to the fact that the U.S. government was actually changing its dietary recommendations to drop flossing from the recommendations. And that was what sort of set off this whole thing in the first place. But it turned out, if you ask the question, well, why did the government do that? It was actually for a rather sensible reason, which is that the government realized that flossing really wasn't a dietary recommendation, right? Diet is about what we eat, not about how we take care of our teeth. So someone logically said, this is really a separate question and you need different experts to look at it. So I actually applaud the person who flagged that. But then the journalist went ahead and looked at the Cochrane reports. And the Cochrane reports are a very good place to start in any conversation about public health, because the Cochrane reports try to summarize the existing knowledge about questions related to health. And the Cochrane reports do say that the evidence regarding flossing is weak. Okay. But then you have to ask another question. So why is it weak? And this gets us back to the problem of the RCTs. So the standard model for the so-called gold standard of a randomized clinical trial is that it should be double blind. That is to say, neither the person administering the treatment or drug nor the person receiving it should know which they're getting, the actual drug or treatment versus the placebo. And this actually came up in the vaccine trials because the vaccines, these COVID vaccines, do have pretty obvious side effects. Particularly many people who have now had the second shot have experienced this. If you get massive side effects from your second shot, well, it's probably pretty clear you don't have the placebo, right? So even a double-blind trial is not necessarily going to be completely, opaque in terms of who's getting what. But the goal is that you should not know because we know that if you do know, it can influence how you react. Okay, so that's all very well and good. But there's no way to do a double-blind trial of dental flossing, right? I mean, if your teeth are being flossed or not. Also, floss, what clinicians call a intervention-sensitive technique. That is to say, some people are good at flossing and some people are bad at it. But it turns out there actually are some studies, and I found one study where they'd actually got nurses to floss the teeth of children in a school. And when you had people who knew how to do it right and did it regularly, it turned out those children not only had healthier gums, but fewer cavities. So where we have appropriate studies, those studies do in fact show a positive effect. So this is a perfect example of the problem of using the right tool for the job. A randomized double-blind trial will not give you good answers about flossing, but some other kinds of studies could give you good answers. And so this is where you have to look at all of the evidence and say, well, which evidence is appropriate in this case? And the answer is floss your teeth.
Yes, thankfully. Well, here then the counter to the randomized controlled test is the natural experiment that you then use comparative methods. So X number of people smoke. Let's look at the difference between smokers and non-smokers, assuming we get accurate information and people are relatively honest, which is one of the problems with dietary studies is, who knows what people are really eating versus what they say they're eating. And I think that's one of the problems why those stories keep changing. Eggs are bad. No, eggs are good. No, eggs. Yeah.
Well, that's why we have population studies, right? We do know that people lie. Two big things people lie about: sex and what they eat. So you can't rely on self-reporting for studies of sex or food, but you can do population studies. And when you look at populations and you compare the United States, say, to Greece or Korea or China, where the diets are different, you see very, very different disease patterns. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the food industry, particularly the red meat industry, has of late been saying we shouldn't pay attention to population studies. I'm like, yeah, and why are they saying that, right? So if you ever hear someone telling you that a whole category of information is not good, that is a real red flag to say, well, why are they saying that? I mean, why wouldn't we want as much information as possible? And certainly, again, if you think about the tobacco industry, we know there was a long history of the tobacco industry attempting to discredit epidemiology, to say that epidemiology wasn't meaningful, that it was only statistical, because, of course, the epidemiology proved that cigarette smoking was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, let's just hit a couple more points here on sort of some of the bigger issues. I brought up, I had Leonard Mlodinow on the podcast. He wrote a little memoir with his work with Stephen Hawking. Leonard, and he wrote that book, The Grand Design, in which they presented what they called their model-dependent realism. So here's what they wrote here. Let's see. In the history of science, we have discovered a sequence of better and better theories or models, from Plato to the classical theory of Newton to modern quantum theories. It is natural to ask, will this sequence eventually reach an endpoint, an ultimate theory of the universe that will include all forces and predict every observation we can make? Or will we continue forever finding better theories, but never one that can be improved upon? We do not yet have a definitive answer to this question, so they kind of revert back to this idea, well, it's all dependent on the particular model we're using. 1,000 years from now, this may have no application at all. So the most we could say is, kind of provisionally true with a small t. Confirmed to such an extent as Gould defined it, it would be perverse to withhold our provisional assent. Yeah, but we might change our mind in that sense. So now some of that makes me uncomfortable because then it feels like we're sliding toward relativism. Like, well, that's your story, and I got my story. You're calling it a model. It's just a story. We're all telling different stories. So there's no epistemic hierarchy here. You scientists are really no better than anybody else. And you know where that went with the kind of postmodernism. And then the pushback by people like Gross that you cited in your book. And I remember when the science wars happened in the 90s, I thought, they're really making a good point. But then that kind of died down because it was just itself kind of a cultural story that we were all telling ourselves. So give us your thoughts on, to what extent we're kind of buried in a certain model or paradigm or whatever now. How confident should we be in at least some of the big things we believe that 500 years from now, maybe they won't be there?
Yeah, this is one of the really big questions in history and philosophy of science. And it's actually the question that I posed in my first book, The Rejection of Continental Drift, because that was an attempt on my part to look at a case where scientists had really changed their minds in a pretty dramatic way about what they thought was true of the world. So, today we would say continents move. It's an established fact. We understand earthquakes and volcanoes in that context. But 100 years ago, people said, no, continents didn't move. Or if they move vertically, not horizontally. So that's a pretty big shift, right? And it's not that easy to just, reduce it to an approximation or something like that. And so that was the question I took on as my PhD work in my first book. And it's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. And I think the idea of provisional assent, in a way, makes sense. I mean, it is what we're saying. This is the best we can do right now. As far as our evidence tells us, this appears to be correct. But as we said before, the history of science shows that it could change. And so we would be foolish to assert that this is a permanent theory, that things will not change in the future when we know they have changed in the past. And so I assume that's kind of what Hawking is getting at. But at the same time, I don't think Hawking is implying, your worry that therefore it's all kind of equal. Because what we're saying is, but it's not all equal. The theories that we set alone are the ones that the evidence supports, that the weight of scientific evidence, the experimental evidence, the observational evidence, the population studies, the animal studies, the surveys, whatever the data are, they all point to this, and they don't point to that. Now, does that mean that we know for sure that this is right? No, we cannot say that. And that's sort of a tough, as the British say, hard cheese. We have to live with that. And we don't necessarily like it, right? I mean, most of us would like to be able to say, yes, it's true. Wittgenstein has this line about, this is where I put my spade. We'd like to be able to say, this is it. But we can't. But we don't always get what we want in life, right? And so this is one of those things that, yes, we want it. I want it. Most people want it. But, as Mick Jagger says, you can't always get what you want. So what do we do about that? Do we just throw up our hands and say anything goes? No, of course not. What we say is this is the best we can do. And in that sense, science isn't different than other forms of life. You talk about bike racing, right? I mean, I also work with athletes, and athletes talk all the time about their personal best, right? The goal is to do the best you can. And you're happy when you do the best you can. So the goal in science is to come up with the theories that explain the most evidence we have, that do the most work for us in terms of explanatory power or predictive power. And those are the theories we settle on, even though we know that they may change. Now, the other thing we can say about this is, so then what is the relationship between the new theory and the old? And this is where there's a whole complicated story that gets into Kuhn and paradigms, and we would probably have a whole other session. But the most effective strategy, I think, that philosophers have come up with, say, since Kuhn, to try to reconcile this problem, when we have a new theory, are we just throwing away everything of the past, or are we somehow building on it? And the way Kuhn wrote about paradigm shifts really made it seem as if he was saying that we just throw it all away. But actually, if you look at his later writings, he denied that. He said, no, we're not throwing away what we learned. We're still building on it, but now we have a different way of viewing it that for whatever reason is better in that context. So the people who I think have done the most heroic job trying to resolve this are the structural realists. So I don't know if you follow this work in philosophy of science, but the structural realists have argued that there are mathematical structures or mathematical formalisms that even though our understanding of the universe may change, the mathematics still holds together. So, for example, even though relativity, Einstein's theories, give us a very, very different way of understanding space and time, but yet, Newton's laws still work, and we can say why they still work because we can understand that as being the special case when the speed of our, things are small compared to the speed of light. So I think that the structural realists focus on mathematical consistencies may give too much credit to mathematics. But what I do think is that you can often find some areas of consistency, some structures or some relationships that when you look at when you're in the new model, you can still look back and say, okay, well, I understand, I can understand why Ptolemaic astronomy worked, why it made accurate predictions because, and then give some kind of account. And that's kind of where I come down, that I don't think we've thrown everything away. I think that we learned a lot and then we use that to get to the next place. One of the interesting things about Kuhn, like many writers, I personally think his best book was his first book, which is not The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, for which he's most famous, but his book, The Copernican Revolution. And so this is this extremely famous example in the history of science where Ptolemy told us the Earth was the center of the universe. Copernicus says, no, it's not. So that's it kind of is or it isn't, right? There isn't really any easy way to resolve that. But the Copernican Revolution, Kuhn does not use the model of the Gestalt shift or the paradigm shift. He says it's like a bend in the road. And when you're going down a road that takes a sharp bend, there's a moment when you're standing at that bend and you can look back at where you've been and you can understand why you were there and how you got from there to here. But now you're going to go around the bend. And there's going to become a point in the future where you've gone so far around the bend that you actually can't look back. You cannot see the road from where you came. And he says science is like that. And I think that's right.
That's nice.
So we can get to a point where we don't actually understand anymore why people thought the things they used to think. And part of the job of the historian then is to recover that road and to say, here's where we got here. And that road gives us some pretty good confidence that, no, it's not perfect. The road continues and it may be uphill, it may be icy, but we're on this road and it's actually kind of a pretty good journey.
It's an interesting way to put it. I like that. Yeah, it depends on how you're talking about it. I had Michio Kaku on. Well, we released that tomorrow, the day after we're recording this. So I asked him to explain this. If Einstein is right, when I drop my phone like this, it's not falling. It's not being pulled toward the Earth. He says it's being pushed by space-time. And I'm like, okay, so pull, push, these are just words we're using. Mathematically, you can define exactly how it falls, 100 feet, whatever it is, feet per second, whatever. And so in a way, it's just kind of how we talk about these things. And so it's not that Newton was wrong. It's Einstein's building on that. And then a second example was in the 90s, and I became pretty good friends with Steve Gould. And then I got to know Richard Dawkins, and they kind of disputed punctuated equilibrium. So Gould starts off with, he and his colleague describing why there would be gaps in the fossil record. And that, basically they were taking Ernst Mayr's theory of speciation as these, peripheral isolates that break off, and whatever happens to the main population, the isolate, the founding population starts a new population and grows larger. And maybe there's a mountain range in between, or a river, an ocean, or whatever, and then they become their own species. But that happens relatively quickly compared to the long, slow grinding change that happens in the population of the major population, whatever happens to that. Okay. So, and then when I met Ernst, I said, so is punctuated equilibrium a whole new paradigm in evolution? He goes, no, this is just a description of what I've been talking about for 20. Steve Gould was my student. He heard me explain this. I'm like, oh, okay. All right. Okay. But in a way, it's like it's a kind of a social thing. Like, is punctuated equilibrium a big new thing, or is it just a small wrinkle? Is just a new term for an old process that was already discussed? Or in a way, to give Gould some credit, that no one had described why these gaps in the fossil records exist. So he, as a paleontologist, was taking a concept from evolutionary theory, which he got from Ernst Mayr, and applying it to the fossil record, which no one had done. And it's like, okay, you don't have to explain away the missing gaps in the fossil record through some magic. This is what it would look like if this is how evolution operated. So anyway, there's a very social process there.
Well, right. And that's a good example, too, where on the one hand, what you said before, I mean, some of this is about language, the language we use to describe things. But on the other hand, language is important because language also structures how we think about the process. And I would say in that debate, I would take Gould's side because I was a student in those days. And I can remember reading the Gould and Eldridge paper in paleontology class and having a big discussion of it. And certainly we thought it was pretty radical because the way we had been taught to think about evolutionary theory, and remember, this is now coming from the perspective of paleontology. So as an earth scientist, rightly or wrongly, we were taught to think about evolution as this incredibly incremental accumulation of small changes, right? And we were taught that that was rooted in Darwin, which, I think to a large extent is correct. And that Darwin got that from Lyell, which, I think is largely correct. And so the concept, the sort of the mental model we had was this accumulation of tiny, practically imperceptible changes over the vast, expanse of geological time. And as geologists, we were taught that this was the great contribution that geology had made to the world to help the world understand how deep time really was, right? And then Gould comes along and he says, yeah, that's not what's actually happening, right? It's actually pretty static most of the time. And as long as the environment's static, creatures aren't going to actually change that much. But then things can happen. Like you say, two populations become isolated. And then things can look really different pretty quickly. And that felt like a pretty radical claim because it was a different way of thinking about what the process was, even though all the groups were relying on the same evidence. And of course, that is part of the whole challenge of the idea of a paradigm shift, that we could be looking at the same evidence, but for whatever reason now we begin to think about it in a different way. And I think some of the great advances in the history of science are associated with those kinds of changes. People who, for whatever reason, become inspired or motivated to think about the old evidence in a new way.
Yeah, reading your book, I was also reminded of, to flip the vector there, when Ed Wilson in his memoir was complaining about Gould and Lewontin going after him for sociobiology. And they started that, the people for sociobiology, whatever that kind of Marxian type name at Harvard. And Ed Wilson was complaining, well, why did they go to the New York Review of Books and write this 5,000 word essay against me? They could have just walked downstairs to my office and said, dude, what are you doing here? And of course, as you would say in your book, because it's a social process, they wanted to get attention for their perspective. And you don't do that by quietly talking to somebody in their office. You go to the New York Review of Books and you have your 100,000 readers or whatever, and then you get a public hearing.
Right. And of course, that is an example that shows that, science isn't operating in a vacuum. This wasn't just about fossils, right? This was also about a larger social and cultural, because frankly, the New York Review of Books isn't really where I would go as a scientist to have a scientific debate. That's where I go to have a cultural debate. So it shows that in this case, the scientific questions and the cultural ones were getting conflated.
Yeah, and then later, Steve Gould and Steve Pinker had it out in the New York Review of Books again over genetics and the blank slate. It's like, okay, how did these guys become the go-to journal? Well, because they're not a journal. They're, it's a public forum. Yeah, so that's... All right, let's wrap this up and just let me channel my inner Donald Rumsfeld and say there are known knowns, the things that we know, we know. There are known unknowns, the things that we know that we do not know. But then there are the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't even know we don't know. I wonder if there's some epistemological wall we'll hit in science or even philosophy, that there's just some things we can't know, or maybe they're conceptually misconceived, like free will and determinism, the nature of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. We can understand the wiring in the brain, but maybe we can never understand what it's like to be the wiring itself. It's sort of a higher order conceptual problem. Or then if you want to go, full theological here, what was there before the Big Bang or before the multiverse or before the string theory? Where'd the strings come from that the string theory gave rise out of nothing to something? I hear the words. I ask, people like Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson, okay, explain this to me. And they use the words. I'm really not sure I grasp it. And of course, my theist Interlocutors go, no, that's a bunch of bullshit. Those guys are just using words. It's just faith. It's no different than what we're saying. You can't prove the multiverse. I can't prove God. So even Steven. And at some point, we just make the leap.
Yeah. So I think the last thing itself is a leap. I mean, because again, at the end of the day, almost none of this is really about proof, right? This is about evidence and about the arguments or the theories or the models that we judge to be most supported by evidence. So when we were talking earlier, I was thinking about the Big Bang thing. I mean, this is an old argument, right? The Big Bang is an account of the universe. It's supported by empirical evidence, but it doesn't tell us why the Big Bang happened in the first place or if there was anything before the Big Bang. And so it could be, as we said, with respect to evolution, it could be that God decided that the Big Bang was how she wanted to start the universe. Right?
Very nice.
And there's no way we'll ever know that, right? Is there some point in the future where we will figure out a way to know it? Who knows, right? I mean, I think one thing all historians know is that pretty risky to ever predict the end of anything, right? And there's certainly many examples in the past of people who thought, physics was solved, right? I mean, we know their infamous comments that were people who thought, they had a final theory of whatever. History suggests that announcing the end of anything is almost always premature, right? It's like the Mark Twain quip about my rumors of my death. So, I mean, we had the end of science some years ago. We had the end of history, and look how those. So, I think we're going to be on this road for a while. Will there be something different in the future? Of course, there will be. Will we come up with new tools, new ways of thinking about problems? Absolutely. I mean, obviously, machine learning, artificial intelligence is this giant realm that science fiction authors have fun with, in part because it is, so unknown what machines will ultimately be able to do. I just wrote a piece for Scientific American about this, too. I mean, one of the really interesting things about AI is how machines have been able to do all kinds of things that science fiction writers did imagine some years ago. And pretty amazing what machines can do. But one of the, you probably know about, I forgot the name of the paradox, but, the hard things are easy, easy things are hard. Right? We used to always think about chess as a really hard thing, and machines learn to do that pretty easily. But things that we can do routinely, like tie our shoes, machines can't do. So there's obviously a really complicated world of cognition that we don't understand very well. Will there be machines one day that tie our shoes? I mean, maybe, yeah. I mean, I would certainly like a self-driving car that was really, truly self-driving. I have a good friend in AI who was telling me about the limits of self-driving cars. This was a few years ago. And I said, you mean I'm not going to be able to just get in my car and say, home, James? She goes, yeah, not in the next few years. Well, I'm really disappointed. I would really like that. I'd also like a robot that would do my laundry. But, How
about one that can right? unload a dishwasher with fine wine glasses?
Oh, that would be very good too.
I don't trust
Excellent.
that. Now, I drive a Tesla, and I put it on the self-driving mode only on the freeway. Self-driving, it's the steering wheel and so on, and the speed control. And that's nice because you're in the left lane, particularly on LA freeways, and you can zone out listening to an audiobook or whatever, podcast. And but when I drive in the mountains, there's no way. Sometimes I put it on there just to see how it does, and it kind of freaks out around turns. It slows way down, and the people behind me are getting pissed. And, it's like, okay, we have a ways to go here before, and
it's great that you can. I mean, it's definitely an advance. I mean, it's certainly a great advance compared to only a few years ago, but we're not nearly at the point of a car that truly drives home. And we may not be for a while because the car doesn't know how to differentiate between, a rock and a duck, right?
Or the trolley problem, the 5 people on the sidewalk versus the rich old person in the crosswalk versus the 2 people in your back seat who are going to die if you swerve to miss the 5 and hit the 3. Anyway.
Yeah. When I was in graduate school, we used to talk about what we called the rock potato test. So this was a condescending and sneering way of referring to people who we did not think were good earth scientists because they were too much in model world. And we would say the person couldn't pass the rock potato test. That is to say, tell the difference between a rock and a potato. So I think that AI will have truly achieved the singularity when it can pass the rock potato test. That's my version of the Turing test.
That's good. Yes, well, hopefully Ray Kurzweil will live long enough to reach 2030 because that was his prediction for the singularity. I think he maybe bumped it to 2035. And then, of course, you can always bump it to
That's
2040.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, Naomi, here's the final paragraph of your wonderful book. There is so much we do not know, but that is no reason not to trust science on the things we do know. The argument for trust in science is not an argument for blind or blanket trust. It is an argument for warranted confidence against unwarranted skepticism in scientists' findings in their domains of expertise. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your important work. And keep it up. What's next on your big project agenda?
My book, Science on a Mission, is coming out next week. And it's a deep dive, pun intended, into the question of funding in science. So if you want a copy, let me know. I'll have my publisher send me. Maybe we can do another one of these in a few months' time. It's a big book, so it'll take you a little time to read. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a university press book?
University of Chicago Press.
Okay, nice. Okay, good. Oh, so you're addressing this very issue we started off this conversation with. Very good. No wonder that was so much on your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, one reason why I didn't really talk a lot about funding in this book was because I was still, meanwhile, trying to finish this other book that it's all about funding. So, yeah. So that's my next big thing.
I love the book. I loved your book because it deals with all the big questions, which is what it's all about, even if we don't have the answers.
Thank you.
All right, Naomi.
It's been fun talking with you, Michael. Take care.